What comes to mind when you hear the word Pharisee? For most people, the answer is something along the lines of a self-righteous hypocrite. In fact, if you Google the definition of Pharisee, the second definition given is a hypocritical, self-righteous person. Imagine that. We have developed such a strong bias against the Pharisees that they now epitomize all hypocritical, self-righteous people. That is a tough paradigm to shake. And yet, as Christians, we must shake it because this paradigm contributes to the anti-Jewish messaging of much of the church. It was well known that the Pharisees were experts on the Hebrew scriptures, the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. We've talked before about how the Apostle Paul had no problem asserting that he was a Pharisee of Pharisees. In fact, it was a way of establishing his street cred, so to speak. But what if we were to tell you that Jesus himself taught in the manner of the Pharisees of his day? Jesus was a rabbi, and the rabbis of his day were known as Pharisees. This idea really disrupts the common Christian understanding of the Pharisees. Today, we're going to show you how Jesus' teachings flowed in the stream of Pharisaic teaching of his day. We're going to place his teachings in the proper perspective and context, and in doing so, hopefully chip away at underlying anti-Jewish messaging in the Christian church. After this, let's talk about Jesus as a Pharisee, and let's talk Torah. Okay, Gary, as usual, here we go. We're going to be ruffling some feathers.
Well, we should.
You always say that.
I love this, Kathy, and I love the topic of today's discussion because shouldn't we all desire truth, and shouldn't we want to know Yeshua better?
Mm-hmm.
And I think in so doing, it leads to knowing His Father better, and the whole frame of thought of Christianity needs this paradigm shift. Is we're always challenging paradigms. It's healthy. It's good. It's something that we need to do, and I feel privileged to do it.
I do too. You know, it's just not an easy thing, and we've gotten rather adept at it, right? It's like training in any sport. The more you do it, the more it comes easily to you. But Gary, it's really, really hard for some people to do this, to change their mind. Number one, to admit that they're wrong.
Yeah, well, it came easy. For some reason, you and I would rather know the truth and admit we were wrong. And so it comes easier to keep digging and investigating.
Right.
But I've run up against that where I would share something that is, obviously provable through history and through scripture. And someone will say, I know you're right, but.
How about, I know what the Bible says, but
Exactly. That's
right.
kind of dangerous.
Exactly.
Because it's we should be seeking truth so that we can better have a relationship with the Father, with our Messiah. I just think this is a vital exercise, and we have to continue to do it. Does that mean we always have it right? No, we obviously have been wrong in the past, and we will be wrong in the future. But we'll keep digging, keep searching out the truth.
I think that's the key. Is we more often than not, we found out that we were wrong with some of our previous ways of thinking.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not like we always think we're right. It's like lots of times we know we're wrong.
And so when we challenge these ways, these habits, and these paradigms, for the people in our audience, and maybe somebody who's listening to us for the first time, it's just to say, go back and think about it again. Don't just take the word of the last preacher you heard, or even the seminary that you maybe attended. Go back and search it out for yourself. Don't take our word for it, but go and search these things out. And that's what we would challenge everybody to do.
Right.
Don't take our word for it.
Right.
And in fact, to our audience, if you've been following us for a while, you may remember an earlier podcast where we talked about our lizard brains.
This is one of my favorites.
It's a great phrase. And it's basically the part of our brains that responds automatically without processing too much. The back part of our brain is composed of the basal ganglia and the brainstem. It's involved in the primitive drives related to thirst, hunger, sexuality, and territoriality, as well as the habits and procedural memory, like putting your car keys in the same place every day when you come home from work, or riding a bike. This is the part of the brain known as the limbic system. It's thought to be the seat of emotion, addiction, mood, and many other mental and emotional processes. Many people call it the lizard brain because the limbic system is about all the lizard has for a brain function. That's it.
And we see lots of lizards in Florida, so we know. Sometimes ways of thinking get stuck in our lizard brain, and they're hard to dislodge, even if this way of thinking is not helpful or even detrimental to us or to others. Now, think of phobias, for instance. Being afraid to leave your house is not helpful, but trying to overcome it is quite difficult. In a podcast series on the Daily Wire, which was a roundtable discussion about the book of Exodus, my favorite psychologist, I don't really have a lot of psychologists, but I can say that too. I don't really even know any other psychologists, but my favorite is Jordan Peterson. And he said in this series that the reason it's so difficult to get habits or fears or just unhelpful ways of thinking unstuck is that we develop powerful neurophysiological mechanisms that lodge themselves deep into our brains, actually changing the physical makeup of our brains. Now, these mechanisms can be helpful or they can be destructive. Peterson described these destructive mechanisms that he said they're often low resolution and erroneous. And I want to talk about that for a second because I think those are two really descriptive, good descriptors of what happens with some of these ideas. And we all understand what erroneous means, right? Okay, we know it's wrong, right? Maybe it's been passed down by mistake, maybe it's been a purposeful lie. But the one I like better is the low resolution.
Yeah.
It's like you don't have quite enough information yet. And that's what I think happens more often than even maybe just a lie.
Yeah, I think that's good. You're right. We think we have information.
Yes.
And when on further examination, things change. Kathy, that is a great point, and I got an example. I think that a lot of people could relate to. It's probably affected families worldwide. An alcoholic, for example, if he's developed a neurophysiological mechanism that says when times get tough, I need the drink. I need that drink to get me through. Even when they realize that the mechanism is flawed and untrue, it's still hard to shake. In fact, you mentioned Jordan Peterson. He said, you can't really kill this mechanism. You have to build another new mechanism that will shut it down.
Wow.
It's simply another way of understanding paradigm shifting, which it's really hard to do. But this is what this podcast is all about.
Exactly.
Right? I mean, changing paradigms.
Exactly. And like we said, we've gotten used to it. We're trying to get our audience to get used to it. It's a regular exercise, right?
Yeah, and I love the fact that you use that term exercise because muscle memory and exercise is the more we do it, the more it becomes fun.
Exactly. Before we get to the specifics of our task today, I want to say that my understanding of this new paradigm about Yeshua and the Pharisees has been greatly assisted by a 6-week class I took at the local synagogue about the Jewish Talmud. I think I mentioned it in our last podcast. The Talmud is the central text of Rabbinic Judaism and the primary source of religious Jewish law, halakha, and Jewish theology. It was compiled between the years of 30 BC to about 200 AD. And this time, of course, includes the time of Jesus' life. The Talmud is made up of the Mishnah, which is the written form of oral law, which the rabbis believed had been passed down through the generations since Moses received it at Mount Sinai. In Rabbinic Judaism, it is understood that the purpose of the oral law is to help Jews know how to obey the written law, which is the one that most of us Christians understand better, right?
Sure.
We understand the written law and what that is. So thus, if it's written in the law, rest on the Sabbath, the oral law helps you to know exactly what rest means or looks like in your life. The Talmud also includes the Gemara, which is a collection of rabbinic commentary on this oral law over the course of centuries. And what's interesting is I love the way this rabbi said this in our class, that the whole purpose in this back and forth discussion, Gary, is to discover the will and the wisdom of God.
That's beautiful, right? I mean, when you think about it, how many of us have practiced in the business world and even in ministry the idea of brainstorming?
Right.
And when you brainstorm, it's because you bounce back ideas. I used to say, Kathy, when I was pastoring and we had staff, I would say, here's an idea. I'll throw it out on the table. I want it to come back better.
Exactly.
And that's how we would operate. And I think that's the practice we're talking about here, is talking it through. Saying, what is God really saying? And helping each of us understand a little bit more about the wisdom of God.
I think that's exactly what the rabbi is talking about. They value so much that back and forth, which we are just not used to in Christianity.
Right.
We have that idea of one person at the front from the pulpit knows everything,
Right.
and the rest of us don't have any responsibility. And I was reading one thing that the rabbis had written about. Every single Jewish person has a responsibility to engage with the written law or the oral law, since it's been written down in this way. They said it was described as from the scribes and Pharisees, who this is their whole job, right? At that time, to the modern day poor person who has a job and all that. They still have a responsibility to engage in it, which I think is pretty fascinating.
That is healthy because, like you said, I think often the paradigm in the church is, like you said, somebody stands on a pulpit, gives a message, everybody sits quietly, listens, and then they go home. Now, whether they apply it or not is always the question.
And how they apply it.
And how they apply it. Whereas in Judaism, this midrash idea and being involved and engaged, I think makes it more personal, and you're trying to sort out how it applies to my life in everyday fashion from century to century to century.
Exactly.
Right. To today in the 21st century, it might mean a little bit something different, but the principles
still high, and it gets passed on from the teacher to the student.
Right.
Okay, and then the student becomes the teacher and passes it down to the next student. I love that. We plan to do a future podcast that's more specific about the Talmud. But right now, suffice it to say that in looking at the Talmudic texts, I couldn't help but see similarities between Jesus's teachings and the teachings of the Talmudic rabbis. Also, as I was taking this class, I happened to come across a book on my mom's bookshelf that neither of us remembers putting there. And this book is titled Meet the Rabbis, Rabbinic Thought and the Teachings of Jesus. I highly recommend this book if you're interested in this topic. It's excellent.
It's a great topic, because I've heard over the years many Christians really condemn, the idea of anything Talmudic.
Absolutely.
And I get that there are some concerns with some of it, but the old saying, don't throw out the baby with the bathwater.
Yes.
There's so much there. And as you said, or we've been saying from the beginning here, what would Yeshua, what did Jesus, what was his way of thinking compared to these rabbis who put together the Talmud? We've often talked about other low resolution erroneous mechanisms related to the Christian faith. We discussed the arbitrary and erroneous differentiation between the law and grace. We've talked about the idea that the Torah has been abolished, even when Jesus clearly said the exact opposite. We've explained the lie that the church has replaced Israel. All of these beliefs are based on misinformation or lack of information. All of them need to be replaced with the truth. Today we're challenging another low resolution, erroneous neurophysiological mechanism existing.
Say that three times fast.
Within the collective mind of the church. the belief that Jesus, as the first Christian, condemned all things about the Pharisees.
In a sea of people, in a world that is blinded by the truth, the hearts become calloused. You still matter. You are still important, and you are still loved. Ezra International, helping the poorest of the poor Jewish people find their way back home in Israel. Open your heart and help by giving to Ezra International today. Only $30 per month will help a Jewish person find their way back home again.
I wanted to look at that just a little bit more, because this idea, my motivator in looking at these topics, Gary, is to I'm often driven by the motivation that our low resolution, erroneous neurological mechanisms, whatever that because they exist, it's harmful to the Jewish people.
Yes,
right?
Absolutely.
So I want to make sure that there's none of that that's being hurtful to my Jewish brothers and sisters. And for that alone, I think that's worth examining.
I totally agree. That alone would be worth it because of the Christian arrogance that it causes and needs to go, because of the extreme version of that with this replacement theology that we've talked on many podcasts about,
Right.
how harmful that is. And not just, oh, I hurt a Jewish person's feelings. I mean, we've persecuted and killed Jews in the name
Well,
of
think about replacement theology.
Exactly.
That's
what I'm saying.
the big one. But so I think that's a good enough motivation to re-examine some of the things that we think.
Absolutely. I mean, at the minimum, we should have a better relationship with our Jewish people, and then the extreme to prevent those types of things from happening. I mean, all right. So let's start with why we think the way we think, Kathy. In Matthew chapter 23 and Luke 11, we read about Jesus delivering a strong rebuke of the Pharisees, often referred to as the 7 woes. Here are some of those key points. All right, this is a quote from Scripture. The scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. So do and observe what they tell you, but not the works that they do, for they preach but do not practice. I mean, this is Jesus' point.
Right.
Here, Jesus is acknowledging their authority to teach the law, but warns against following their example because their actions do not align with their teachings. This is the definition of a hypocrite. Someone whose words do not match his actions.
Exactly. So that's why I think it's interesting there that he does recognize their authority.
Right.
We know people like that, right? That what comes out of their mouth might be good, right?
Yeah.
And then you look and see what they're doing, and you're like, that's a little incongruent.
This is not exclusive to the Pharisees of today. This is something that we see in our day all the time. And I'm sure everybody that has ever attended a church or had an excuse not to attend a church is because they said, well, it's full of hypocrites.
Oh, I remember my husband always saying if we left the church, what he watched was how people behaved in the parking lot afterwards, right? As they were trying to get out, and if they were aggressive, it kind of negated everything that just happened the last hour because their behavior wasn't consistent with what was being preached there.
And I can't tell you how many times I would be invited out to a lunch and then watch how horribly that individual that asked me out to lunch would treat the
waitress,
waiter. In fact, it's well known in the waitress and waiter world that Sunday afternoon is the worst time to be on the job because of that. Someone leaving a track instead of a tip.
Exactly.
Horrible examples, but we
Yes.
Okay, so Jesus goes on and says, they tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear, and they lay them on the people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to move them with their own fingers. Here, Jesus is criticizing the Pharisees for imposing strict rules on others while not helping to ease their burdens. That's what he's talking about.
That's right. Next, we look at another woe, as we call it, right?
Sure.
They do all their deeds to be seen by others. For they make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long, and they love the place of honor at feast and the best seats in the synagogues and greetings in the marketplace and being called rabbi to others. Once again, this look at me, I'm the Sunday school teacher, I'm the pastor, I'm the whatever. You can see when we're talking about the phylacteries and the fringes, particularly the fringes of the seats, really long. So, and I've had this discussion with other friends. Should they even see the seats, that you're wearing it, or is that between you and God? There can be arguments both ways, but apparently this idea of just wearing the seats for just the purpose of being seen and like, oh, there's the righteous man right there.
Yeah.
It's not the seat and how long you wear it.
No. I mean, Jesus quoted Micah 6:8. That we're to do justly, to love chesed or mercy, and walk humbly
Yes.
before our God. And that humility comes with understanding who we are versus who He is.
Yes.
And that is often overlooked. I can remember the grossest example that I can remember of something like this, Kathy, was I went to speak at a particular church. I'm not going to mention names or place. Oh my goodness, I'm sitting there and waiting for my turn to speak, and the pastor was introduced, and all of a sudden I thought, have I entered the World Wrestling Federation? Because the lights went dim, that they started flashing, the announcer got up, and an entourage came before the pastor as he came in, and there's a great announcement of him coming into.
Oh my goodness gracious!
I was horrified. I thought, really? I mean, we're to walk humbly before our God, and they were making this man out to be, I mean, the king had entered the compound. It was horrible. It was a horrible example of just the opposite of what Yeshua was talking earlier.
So what else did Yeshua say? But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you shut the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. For you neither enter yourselves, nor allow those who would enter to go in. So here Jesus condemns them for preventing others from entering God's kingdom through their hypocrisy.
Right.
That's what we're talking about. Just like you said, a non-believer seeing that situation, is that going to turn him toward Jesus? I mean, toward God? No, I can't imagine.
No, I can't, and because it's so glorifying self. It was horrible. It was exactly the opposite what I believe Yeshua was calling us to do. All right, well, here's a particular favorite, Kathy, that we hear often and being quoted along the woes. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you are like whitewashed tombs, which outwardly appear beautiful, but within are full of dead people's bones and all uncleanness. So you also outwardly appear righteous to others, but within you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. In our podcast on the traditions of men, we talked about Matthew 15, 1-9, where the Pharisees criticized Jesus' disciples for not washing their hands according to tradition. And Jesus' response is very interesting. He says this, and why do you break the commandments of God for the sake of your traditions, you hypocrites? Well did Isaiah prophesy to you when he said, the people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines and the commandments of men. As doctrines, the commandments of men. And that's where we have to distinguish what Yeshua was saying. He's talking about the traditions of men, not the Torah, not the commandments of God. And that's what's so often misunderstood.
Exactly. That's misunderstood, misrepresented all the time. Yes, definitely. And that's where we get this condemnation of all things Jewish, so to speak, right? Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So it's extremely clear that Jesus had some issues with the Pharisees, but did he condemn all of them, or even the existence of Pharisaism? Or was he simply recognizing how far off track some of these in this group had gotten? It's quite easy, after reading through this laundry list of grievances, to conclude that Jesus was at odds with all the Pharisees in general. But do we have the whole picture, or do we have a low resolution, at least partially erroneous neurophysiological mechanism, I said that we need to replace with a new higher resolution mechanism, a new mechanism that's based on more and better information? This, of course, is the reason for this podcast. So if you're willing, let's work on developing a new higher resolution mechanism to help us understand Jesus's relationship with the Pharisees.
All right. So first, many Christians have been taught to view Jesus' criticism of the Pharisees through a lens where Jesus is an outsider. It's commonly believed that Jesus was the new leader of the Christian movement, a movement established in opposition of Judaism. And they think he's condemning all things Jewish in the Jewish community, and in particular the Jewish leadership. However, we have to remember that Jesus was Jewish.
Imagine that.
Never changed. So his critique of the Pharisees was a confrontation among brothers. In fact, it is this very fact that he is an insider that makes his argument so effective. Similar to how an ex-smoker can always present a more compelling argument for stopping smoking than someone who has never smoked. We pointed this out. So this same thing, we pointed it out in our podcast about the Apostle Paul. He was a Jew arguing among other Jews.
And that is critical.
It is
remember, that's essential. And we're going to keep reminding people about that. But we're out of time now, and we're going to have to pick this up in our next podcast.